Mayho Siki considered the local home center a toy box of infinite possibilities, the perfect start to a fun weekend. However, her anticipation quickly dissolved into utter bewilderment as she stared at the building before her, unable to comprehend the bizarre sight. Just a short while ago, she had arrived at the Dama Home Center, eager to explore one of the few places in her rural town where she could truly relax. It was her personal playground, and she was ready to head right in at opening time. Bursting through the entrance, she sprinted across the polished floor, thrilled to be the very first customer of the day. Her joyful sprint faltered as she took in the sprawling aisles. The massive store was completely devoid of life, prompting a confused murmur to escape her lips. She wandered past the empty checkout counters, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. The automatic doors had opened normally, yet there wasn't a single staff member or customer in sight. Staring into a display mirror, she pondered an eerie thought. It felt as though she had stepped into a mirror world, a place where everything looked exactly the same, but humanity had simply vanished. A small wave of relief washed over her as she spotted a cat and a dog resting quietly in their enclosures. At least the animals in the pet corner were still there, offering a tiny shred of normalcy. Her brief moment of comfort was violently interrupted. A sudden, massive tremor shook the building, sending her tumbling backward onto the hard floor as she cried out in alarm, desperately wondering what was happening. Sprawled on the ground, panic seized her. She frantically reasoned that a massive earthquake must have triggered an evacuation alert she somehow missed, berating herself for daydreaming about mirror worlds when she should have been running. Just as she scrambled to get up, a sharp voice cut through the chaos. She looked up to see a striking young woman with long, pointed ears and a fantasy-style outfit standing over her. The stranger called out to her, leaving Mayho completely disoriented. Still dazed, Mayho could only stare at the beautiful newcomer, absurdly wondering if this elf-like girl was a new part-time employee. She muttered to herself in exasperation, overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of a strange building and a collapsed girl. Deciding she had no idea what to do, she turned to leave, offering a polite but hasty excuse to the empty air. Before she could take another step, something caught her eye. She stopped, her gaze slowly drifting upward as a massive shadow loomed over her. A colossal, rough-hewn stone wall now completely blocked the entrance to the Dama Home Center. She stared in utter disbelief, her eyes wide with panic as she stammered, trying to comprehend the impossible structure that had materialized out of nowhere. The strange, white-haired girl suddenly spoke up, asking if they had returned to reality. Mayho spun around, her confusion deepening as she noticed the gleaming hilt of a real sword strapped to the girl's hip. She blurted out, asking if the stranger was even human. Trying to rationalize the situation, Mayho asked if the girl was just a dedicated cosplayer. The stranger simply introduced herself as Fiona. Realizing her own lack of manners, Mayho quickly offered her own name, though she couldn't help but marvel at Fiona's flawless Japanese. Fiona tilted her head, puzzled by the name. She asked if Siki meant Mayho was a noble, or perhaps a mage, given her unusual clothing. Mayho's sweat dropped, completely lost by the sudden influx of fantasy terminology. Glancing around the desolate area, Fiona asked if there was anyone else nearby. Mayho shook her head, confirming that despite searching everywhere, the place was completely deserted. Pointing toward the massive stone barrier, Mayho demanded to know where the wall had come from. Fiona calmly replied that the wall had always been there. It was the home center and Mayho that had suddenly appeared. Fiona explained that she had been careless and triggered a teleportation trap hidden within a treasure chest. Mayho's mind raced as she repeated the words, treasure chests, traps, teleportation, slowly realizing that if Fiona wasn't a cosplayer, those words meant something entirely different. Desperation creeping into her voice, Mayho pointed a trembling finger downward and asked exactly where they were. Fiona looked at her with absolute seriousness and stated that they were in the Melquodia dungeon. She clutched her head in sheer panic, her mind racing to process the impossible. Was she dead? Had the earthquake killed her, sending her to another world? None of it made sense, especially not the massive Dama Home Center sitting right behind her. Desperately, she tried to convince herself it was all just a bizarre dream. Her spiraling thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a loud, echoing rumble. She blinked, her panic momentarily replaced by confusion, as she turned to see the elf standing stiffly, a deep blush spreading across her cheeks. Realizing the source of the sound, she gently asked if her new companion was hungry. Averting her eyes in deep shame, Fiona confessed that she hadn't had a single bite to eat in 3 entire days, a revelation that left the teenager utterly stunned. Springing into action, she sprinted down the familiar aisles of the home center. With so many options lining the shelves, she frantically scanned the inventory, muttering to herself as she tried to decide on the best meal for someone who had been starving. Settling on a plan, she gathered a portable camping stove and several bottles of water. She reasoned that a gentle, boil-in-the-bag rice porridge would be the safest and most comforting option for an empty stomach. While the food prepared, she cheerfully offered a sealed plastic bottle of natural water to the swordswoman. Fiona accepted it hesitantly, staring down at the unfamiliar transparent cylinder in her gloved hands. She poked and prodded at the bottle, turning it upside down in complete bewilderment as she asked how to drink from it. Watching her struggle, Mayho suddenly realized that modern packaging was a completely alien concept in this fantasy world. Returning her focus to the meal, she popped open a glass jar of savory bonito flakes. Nearby, the pouch of porridge bubbled away in a metal pot over the portable stove's open flame. Moments later, she presented a steaming bowl of thick rice porridge, generously garnished with the savory flakes. She offered the warm, comforting dish with an inviting smile. She carefully handed the bowl over, gently warning her companion about the heat. Fiona accepted the meal with a soft, grateful murmur, the tension in her shoulders finally beginning to ease. She stared down at the steaming bowl, her brow furrowed in confusion as she asked what it was. Mayho gently explained that it was rice porridge, realizing her companion had likely never encountered the dish before. Her internal worries were interrupted by a loud, demanding growl erupting from the elf's stomach. Hearing the rumble, the dark-haired girl second-guessed herself, fretting that the unfamiliar, foreign-looking meal might be off-putting. She watched closely as the elf scooped up a small portion and took a tentative bite, her anxiety mounting as she feared the strange flavors might be rejected. Those fears vanished instantly as the young warrior's eyes widened in pure wonder. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes as she breathed out a soft, awestruck declaration that the meal was absolutely delicious. She immediately began to devour the porridge with frantic speed, her spoon clinking rapidly against the bowl. Startled by the sudden voracity, Mayho quickly reassured her that there was no need to rush, promising that they had an entire store's worth of supplies at their disposal. Looking at the small mountain of empty plastic bowls and discarded wrappers that soon sat between them, she let out a soft sigh of amazement at the sheer volume of food consumed. Her amazement softened into a gentle smile as the frantic energy settled, leaving a quiet stillness in the air. Clenching the fabric of her skirt, the silver-haired girl softly expressed her deep gratitude, confessing that the meal had truly saved her. The gentle atmosphere broke the last of the warrior's composure, and heavy tears began to spill down her cheeks. Her voice trembled as she admitted just how close to death she had felt, the sheer terror of her near starvation finally catching up to her. She reached out, gently stroking her companion's hair while offering soft words of comfort and praising her resilience. Internally, Mayho marveled at the sheer willpower it must have taken to survive alone in such a desolate place for 3 agonizing days without a single bite to eat. Her comforting presence allowed the exhausted warrior to finally relax, her eyes drifting shut as she succumbed to a deep, peaceful sleep. Noticing the chill in the air, Mayho quietly resolved to fetch a blanket from the store's aisles to keep her warm. She gently encouraged the hungry animals to eat, setting down bowls of food for a small dog and a striped cat in the store's pet corner. Walking past the glass enclosures, she observed the surprisingly wide variety of creatures, from fish and beetles to rabbits and reptiles. A heavy realization settled over her. These animals had been caught up in a strange phenomenon just as she had, leaving her to figure out how to care for them all. Her train of thought was suddenly broken as a faint noise from the nearby canned goods aisle caught her attention, prompting her to turn her head in curiosity. Mayho stared intently, her thoughts drifting back to the supplies she had gathered. She recalled grabbing several boil-in-the-bag meals from the shelf, a sudden realization widening her eyes as the implications set in. Leaving the supplies behind, she wandered through the desolate, industrial corridors. The silence was absolute. She had searched the entire area without finding a single soul. She noted the severed power lines hanging overhead, finding it a bizarre mystery that the facility still had electricity despite the damage. Ahead, a large structure loomed, which she assumed had to be the way out. The structure proved to be a colossal, iron-studded wooden door, towering over her and her small canine companion. She reasoned that Fiona must have found this exit as well, but likely lacked the strength to move such a massive barrier. Curious about its weight, she reached for the thick iron ring, determined to secure their escape route. To her absolute bewilderment, the heavy timber yielded with a deep groan, swinging outward with effortless ease. She blinked in surprise, realizing the intimidating gate wasn't nearly as heavy as it appeared. Beyond the threshold lay a daunting flight of stone steps stretching upward into the gloom. She let out a weary groan at the sight of the climb, casually instructing her little companion to stay behind and play in the immediate area. As she ascended the stone steps, a deep, resonant rumbling echoed through the shaft. She paused, her brow furrowing as she tried to identify the ominous sound. Remembering Fiona's mention of a dungeon, she deduced they were deep underground. A sudden wave of anxiety hit her as she questioned the air quality and safety of the subterranean passage, briefly considering turning back. Reaching the summit, her breath hitched, her eyes widening in sheer astonishment at the sight before her. Instead of the open sky she expected, she found herself staring into another vast, unfamiliar expanse, leaving her completely bewildered about her true location. Meanwhile, in another part of the ruins, Fiona stirred from her slumber with a soft groan. Her heavy eyelids fluttered open, her gaze dropping to the unfamiliar fabric draped over her. She grasped the edge of the material, slowly realizing someone had covered her with a blanket. The fog of sleep vanished instantly as fragmented memories flooded her mind. She recalled the gentle touch of a stranger feeding her, her eyes widening in a mix of shock and confusion as she tried to process her own helpless behavior. A wave of intense shame washed over her, her teeth gritting as she tightly clenched her fist. The thought of being seen in such a vulnerable, embarrassing state gnawed at her pride, leaving her bitterly cursing her own weakness. She stepped into the vast, empty room, her footfalls echoing in the silence. Glancing around the deserted space, she called out softly, hoping for a response. Panic began to set in as she sprinted through the ruined, debris-filled corridors. She cried out for her companion, terrified by the prospect of being left completely alone once more. Coming to a halt near a stone pillar, she gasped for breath, her eyes wide with mounting dread. The realization that the girl was nowhere to be found gnawed at her. Suddenly, her gaze locked onto the massive stone archway ahead. She stared in absolute disbelief. The colossally heavy doors stood wide open. Her mind raced, recalling that the door had been sealed by powerful magic she herself couldn't break. Realizing her companion must have somehow bypassed the ward and ventured upward alone, she cursed her own lack of explanation and dashed through the archway, screaming her name. Emerging on the other side, she froze. There, resting peacefully on the stone floor of a grand, arched chamber, was a colossal, dark-scaled dragon. Sitting casually near the beast's massive snout was the very girl she had been desperately searching for. Terror gripped her as she recognized the creature from ancient legends. It was a red dragon, a mythical king capable of human speech and devastating ancient magic, a being said to have destroyed entire kingdoms. She trembled, wondering if this apocalyptic beast was the final guardian of the ruins. Despite the overwhelming danger, the young girl seemed completely unfazed, happily holding up a glowing rectangular device toward the slumbering giant. Watching from a distance, the swordswoman was utterly baffled, questioning if her friend had been struck by some sort of charm magic to act so recklessly. Swallowing her fear, she cautiously stepped closer to the beast's massive claws. She called out in a hushed, trembling voice, demanding to know why her companion was lingering in such a terrifying place. The girl turned around, her face lit up with a bright, innocent smile. Completely ignoring the peril, she gestured toward the legendary monster and cheerfully remarked on how incredibly pretty the creature was. She protests as her companion frantically drags her away from the chamber. Fiona, desperate to escape, scolds her to keep quiet and stop saying foolish things as they retreat. Sprinting down the stone corridor, the two finally pause to catch their breath. Far from terrified, the dark-haired girl beams with excitement, praising both the incredible sight and her friend's carrying speed, even proudly displaying a photograph she managed to snap on her glowing device. Baffled by this reaction, Fiona asks how she could possibly not be terrified of the beast. The question barely registers with the girl, whose mind is still captivated by the overwhelming beauty and sheer scale of the legendary creature she just witnessed. With a cheerful, almost dreamy smile, she casually admits that while it might be scary, being eaten by a dragon wouldn't be such a bad way to die. The elf stares back in absolute, wide-eyed horror, realizing with chilling certainty that her companion is completely out of her mind. Recovering slightly, Fiona firmly states her own desire to live. Her companion quickly agrees, sheepishly rubbing her head and promising to be more careful next time, though the mere suggestion of a next time only exasperates the elf further. Trying to ground the situation in reality, Fiona reiterates their dire circumstances. She explains that they are trapped at the very bottom of the Melquodia dungeon, the most dangerous labyrinth in the world. Their only hope for survival is to fight their way up through dozens of floors filled with increasingly powerful monsters. As the ambient magic grows denser the deeper they go. She emphasizes the sheer hopelessness of their plight by describing the beast they just fled. The Dragon King is a legendary entity, an insurmountable force of nature that proves some monsters simply cannot be defeated by human hands. Despite the grim lecture, the dark-haired girl remains completely unfazed, happily declaring that dragons are amazing and that she was lucky to see one. Trembling with anxiety, Fiona wonders aloud if anything actually scares her friend, dreading what would happen if the beast were to wake. Pushing the fear aside, a sudden realization dawns on the elf. She remembers seeing another door in the dragon's chamber, one that leads upstairs. If they could just sneak past this slumbering giant, they might have a path forward. She completely lost her composure, tears streaming down her face as she wailed about their impending doom. She frantically alternated between declaring they had to defeat the beast and sobbing that it was hopeless and she was going to die. Watching the elf's rapid mood swings, Mayho calmly noted how exhausting her emotions seemed to be. The panicked elf continued to sob uncontrollably, her face flushed and streaked with tears. In her trembling hand, she inexplicably clutched a thick, unlit cigar, her breath hitching with every desperate gasp. Dropping to her knees, she bowed repeatedly, crying out to the great spirits and Lord Luknuvies for salvation. Standing behind the groveling elf, Mayho tilted her head, mildly confused, and asked if she actually smoked cigars. Ignoring the question, the elf weakly pleaded for someone to slay the evil dragon. Staring down at her companion's tearful, desperate face, Mayho came to the quiet realization that this girl might actually be completely out of her mind. The elf's breakdown escalated into a loud, continuous wail. She began rambling incoherently, frantically calculating the dietary needs of such a massive creature, noting the lack of droppings, and ultimately concluding in sheer terror that they were destined to be its next meal. Mayho simply watched, bewildered by the rapid-fire mumbling. Deciding she had heard enough, the dark-haired girl stepped forward with a sigh. She casually declared that since there was no other option, it was a shame, but they would just have to go and defeat the dragon themselves. The casual suggestion stopped the elf's tears instantly. She stared up from the floor, her eyes wide with absolute shock, stammering in disbelief as she repeated the absurd idea of actually fighting the beast. Still reeling, she demanded to know how. In response, Mayho simply turned away. A large, fluffy dog had suddenly appeared by her side, and as she looked at it, she casually mentioned that her father was a rather eccentric man. Gently stroking the large animal's head, the teenager explained that her father had a habit of hoarding all sorts of bugs and small animals, constantly modifying their home to accommodate them. She added that if she ever let her guard down, he would vanish on sudden trips, leaving her alone for long stretches of time. Because of that upbringing, she clenched her fist with newfound resolve. She firmly stated that simply waiting around to die, or leaving this place without doing anything, would make coming all the way to another world a complete waste. She threw her fists into the air, her eyes sparkling with uncontainable excitement. An unseen world was waiting for her, and she declared with absolute certainty that she was going to defeat the dragon. Her elven companion stared at her, her brow furrowing in deep concern as she questioned if such a feat was even possible. Unfazed, the dark-haired girl casually replied that while it would take some preparation, living things died surprisingly easily. The chilling nonchalance of the statement left the elf wide-eyed and speechless. Still reeling, the elf asked if her companion was secretly harboring immense strength. The girl immediately shattered that hope, cheerfully admitting she was completely weak. Exasperated, the elf demanded to know why she was acting so carefree, accusing her of failing to grasp the sheer power of their enemy. With a smug chuckle, the girl countered that it was actually her companion who didn't understand the situation. Gesturing broadly to the space behind them, she asked if the elf hadn't noticed their greatest advantage. She proudly announced that they had the ultimate backpack right there, leaving her companion utterly bewildered. The grand reveal was a massive, sprawling building looming over them. It wasn't a magical armory, but a colossal, modern hardware store, a home center standing inexplicably in the middle of the fantasy landscape. Beaming with unwavering optimism, the dark-haired girl assured her stunned companion that everything would work out perfectly, placing all her faith in the bizarre structure before them. Inside, the aisles were packed floor to ceiling with practical, everyday supplies, industrial fans, and heavy-duty containers. She explained that this sprawling commercial hub, Melquodia, had grown into the world's largest dungeon town, providing them with an endless arsenal of unconventional weapons. Her enthusiasm reached a fever pitch as she threw her fist up once more, directly challenging the looming threat of the Dragon King. She vowed that they would survive this ordeal. Thus began the unlikely tale of a modern mage and an elven dungeon explorer, armed with nothing but hardware store supplies against a legendary beast. Standing before the brightly lit facade of the Alma Home Center, Mayho tried to piece together the bizarre reality. She gestured toward the massive building, confirming to Fiona that it was a colossal retail store from her own world, somehow transported alongside her. Holding up a cracked, glowing jewel, she questioned if it was the legendary wish-granting stone the elf had mentioned. The elf maiden lowered her gaze, admitting that in her desperate plea for help, she had used the stone, believing its power to be mere myth. To her shock, the massive structure had materialized in response. Hearing this confession, a sudden, horrifying realization dawned on Mayho's face. She snapped, her eyes widening in pure fury as she lunged forward. With a sharp, accusatory yell, she blamed Fiona entirely for ripping her from her home and dragging her into this strange, dangerous world. The reality of their location was grim. They were trapped within the great Melquodia dungeon, a labyrinthine abyss notorious across the land. It was a treacherous place, plunging 30 floors deep, teeming with monsters so formidable that the greatest adventurers had only ever breached the 14th level. Its sheer scale alone classified it among the world's most elite and deadly dungeons. For any seasoned warrior, the mere thought of being forced to conquer it starting from the absolute bottom floor was enough to instill absolute despair. Despite the overwhelming odds, the dark-haired girl quickly regained her composure, a confident smirk replacing her earlier panic. She assured her skeptical companion that she had a plan, declaring that their first order of business was to ascend the stairs and defeat the dragon waiting above. Before facing the beast, however, she needed to verify something. The two girls ventured deeper into the brightly lit aisles of the displaced retail store, their footsteps echoing softly against the polished linoleum floor as they scanned the neatly organized shelves. They stopped before a display of instant porridge cups. Pointing at the meager remains, Mayho noted dryly that this was the very same food the elf had ravenously consumed earlier, nearly wiping out the entire stock in one sitting. Flushed with deep embarrassment, the elf begged her to drop the subject. Ignoring the plea, Mayho pressed on, her brow furrowing as she pointed out a glaring inconsistency. It was highly suspicious that the shelves weren't completely empty. She pondered aloud if the store was somehow restocking itself, perhaps through the lingering spirit of a phantom clerk or even the dungeon's own monsters. Sweat beading on her forehead, Fiona quickly shot down the theory, gently reminding her overactive friend that this specific floor was completely devoid of any monstrous presence. She stared intently at the shelf, reaching out to grab a box of granola. The moment her fingers pulled it away, another identical box materialized in its place. Both girls gasped in unison, their eyes wide with disbelief as she realized even the expiration dates matched perfectly. Thrilled by the discovery, she declared they had an infinite food supply, jokingly asking her companion if she wanted to live there for eternity. The elf nervously declined the offer. Brushing off the joke, the dark-haired girl confidently stated that this endless inventory was exactly what they needed to execute their plan, immediately dashing off to gather ingredients. Soon, a thick, dark liquid boiled violently inside a large metal pot, emitting ominous bubbles that popped with a sinister rhythm. Now, wearing heavy gas masks, the two stood over the concoction. The alchemist of the hour explained her deadly recipe, listing off extracted nicotine, rat poison, pesticide, and sulfuric acid. She cheerfully announced she was combining these chemical all-stars to create a super deadly poison, leaving the elf stammering in absolute terror at the toxic brew. Stepping back from a makeshift cauldron outside the home center, the elf questioned the danger of the mixture, pointing out that the store only sold daily essentials. Her companion calmly clarified that a single spoonful would be enough to kill a man, noting that the only difference between medicine and poison was the dosage. Removing her mask, the dark-haired girl sparked a lighter to ignite a small, rolled cylinder between her lips. The elf gasped in amazement, mistaking the simple plastic lighter for a magical tool, an assumption that was immediately and flatly denied. She exhaled a plume of smoke, savoring the taste. As she relaxed, she pondered the elf's reaction, realizing that if genuine magical items existed in this world, they must hold incredible value. Her attention drifted back to her companion, who was still staring wide-eyed at the tiny flame dancing from the lighter, utterly captivated by the mundane object. Taking another drag, she casually instructed the elf to take off her clothes. The sudden command barely registered at first, met only with a blank, confused stare. The realization finally hit, causing the elf to flinch back in shock and demand an explanation. Adopting an unusually polite and formal tone, the dark-haired girl explained that she needed to examine the biological differences between their bodies, leaving the elf even more bewildered by the sudden shift in manners. She recoiled slightly, her face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and suspicion as she questioned the necessity of such a request. Waving her hands defensively, her companion insisted it was purely for research to defeat the dragon, vehemently denying any ulterior motives about wanting to see a pretty girl from another world undressed. Resigning herself to the bizarre situation, the elf began to unfasten her collar, reasoning that since they were both girls, there was nothing to be embarrassed about. However, when the dark-haired girl casually offered to strip down as well to make it fair, she was met with an immediate, panicked refusal. With her top removed, she stood bare-shouldered, glancing back nervously as the makeshift examination began. Nearby, medical instruments lay ready, prepared to measure the vital signs of a being from another world. Shifting into an analytical mindset, the young store owner noted that her companion's outward appearance, pulse, and heart placement were identical to a human's. She pondered whether magical abilities required special internal organs or if the power was drawn from an external source, ultimately admitting her lack of medical expertise before asking the elf to hold still for a moment. Without warning, she leaned in intimately close, her face mere inches from the elf's, scrutinizing her features with an intense, almost uncomfortable focus. Continuing her hands-on inspection, she noted that the elf's baseline body temperature felt slightly higher than normal. The invasive probing sent her companion into a flustered panic, her face burning bright red as she frantically swatted the wandering hands away, begging her to stop. Moments later, with her clothes safely back on, the exhausted swordswoman asked what the humiliating ordeal had actually accomplished. Holding up a whiteboard detailing her toxic concoction, the dark-haired girl cheerfully concluded that despite originating from different worlds, their weight, blood pressure, and basic biology were essentially identical. This biological revelation sparked a new theory regarding the massive beast slumbering in the depths of the dungeon. She reasoned that if an otherworldly elf shared human biology, then perhaps the terrifying dragon was not an invincible monster, but simply another living, breathing creature bound by the same physical vulnerabilities. Armed with this deduction, she turned back to her companion, her confidence renewed. Holding up a small, gleaming jewel, she declared that this item, combined with the treasure trap they had discussed earlier, would be the key to their victory. She elaborated on her strategy, pointing out the strange convenience of finding human-usable items inside a monster's domain. She theorized that whoever designed the dungeon intentionally left a way for the boss to be defeated, concluding that since the dragon was a living organism, a drastic change in temperature or a lethal dose of poison would undoubtedly kill. Her grand strategy hit an immediate roadblock when Fiona raised a glaringly practical question. How exactly were they supposed to make the beast drink the poison? The inquiry was met with a heavy, stunned silence as the realization washed over the young strategist. Breaking the awkward quiet, she nervously admitted that she hadn't thought that far ahead. Sweating under her companion's gaze, she desperately brainstormed aloud, suggesting they might be able to inject the toxin through a steel pipe while the creature snored. However, she quickly muttered that if the beast woke up during the attempt, they would be entirely doomed. Realizing the sheer absurdity of the idea, she abruptly clapped her hands together and declared they were putting the poison strategy on hold in favor of a completely different plan. The sudden pivot left the elf utterly exasperated, crying out in disbelief that they were abandoning the idea after all the effort they had just put into it. Standing before the brightly lit self-service pumps of the home center, Mayho admitted to Fiona that her upcoming plan leaned a bit on the dangerous side. When questioned by Fiona about whether the facility possessed some form of attribute nullification, Mayho pondered the idea, doubting that standard elemental concepts like fire or water resistance would apply to modern fuel. To demonstrate the sheer volatility of her idea, she proposed a small experiment, directing her companion's attention to a solitary metal container resting on the ground. She explained that the highly flammable liquid inside, known as gasoline, vaporizes and mixes with oxygen. As Fiona watched in confusion, wondering if this was some strange ritual, Mayho casually tossed a lit lighter toward the container. The resulting blast sent the elf reeling backward with a startled cry. A wicked grin spread across Mayho's face as she revealed the true scale of her plot. They were going to transport every drop of gasoline they possessed inside the dungeon and trigger a massive, catastrophic explosion. Putting the plan into motion, she instructed Fiona to handle the volatile fuel with extreme care. Over the course of several days, the pair made grueling, silent round trips up and down the dungeon stairs, meticulously stockpiling the containers right under the nose of the slumbering dragon. Exhausted from the labor, she slumped against a wall, surrounded by buckets filled with nails, bolts, and axes. She explained to the still-working elf that this makeshift shrapnel would inflict devastating extra damage upon detonation. She further elaborated on the mechanics of their world, describing a phenomenon known as dungeon acclimatization. By defeating monsters, humans could absorb their magic power to increase their own strength, a process she cheerfully likened to leveling up in a video game. When asked if their preparations were finally complete, the dark-haired girl shook her head. With a completely straight face, she declared that for the final phase of their operation, they would have to work entirely in the nude, leaving her companion staring in stunned silence. Facing immediate accusations of being a massive pervert from the shocked elf, Mayho remained unfazed. She defended her extreme directive, warning that a single spark of static electricity from their clothes would ignite the vaporized fuel and mean instant death for them both. She smiled brightly, assuring her companion that she could handle the final preparations alone and suggesting a well-deserved break. The elf, however, caught a slip of the tongue, questioning the phrase this time. Refusing to be sidelined, the elf stepped forward with renewed determination. She firmly stated her intention to help, unwilling to be left behind while her friend took all the risk, leaving the dark-haired girl momentarily taken aback. A faint blush crept across the elf's cheeks as she averted her gaze, her voice softening. She confessed her underlying fear, worrying about what might happen if her companion faced danger entirely alone. With their resolve united, they proceeded with the perilous plan. Stripped of their clothing to eliminate the risk of static sparks, they meticulously poured the liquid fuel into containers spaced evenly apart, relying on the cool air to keep the volatile fumes from vaporizing prematurely. Below them, the colossal beast slumbered peacefully in the center of a sunken arena. The tiered architecture of the chamber formed a natural basin, creating the perfect, contained environment for a devastating, concentrated blast. Surveying the sleeping target, the dark-haired girl outlined the final, crucial phases: vaporization, mixing, and ignition. She noted the necessity of electricity for the process, while acknowledging the extreme danger of running cables down to the beast level. Her solution was a massive, portable lithium-ion battery, triumphantly procured from her favorite hardware store. She confidently explained that such power stations were designed to resist combustion, making them safe to operate even in this highly volatile environment. To execute the vaporization, they carefully positioned industrial fans and submersible heaters within the fuel containers. Once connected to the battery, the heaters would rapidly boil the liquid, while the fans would churn the heavy fumes into the surrounding air. For the final spark, she brandished a hammer, preparing to violently extract a spark plug from a portable camping stove. As her companion flailed in panic, begging her to stop, she detailed her plan to wire the salvaged igniter to a mechanical timer, setting the catastrophic chain reaction to trigger in exactly 11 hours. With the timer set and the remaining fuel scattered across the stone floor, they activated the power supply. The heavy hum of the fans echoed through the cavern as the heaters began their work, slowly filling the enclosed arena with a lethal, invisible cloud of explosive vapor. With the trap set, Mayho stretched her arms high, declaring that all they could do now was wait. Fiona, however, remained anxious, questioning if their plan would truly defeat the beast and what they would do if it failed. Unfazed, Mayho brushed off the concern, assuring her companion that they would cross that bridge when they came to it, hinting that she still had another trick up her sleeve. As the hours ticked by, she humbly deflected her companion's praise, crediting the wonders of modern science and a hardware store instead. She then turned the compliment around, commending the elf's incredible strength in carrying all the heavy fuel, causing a faint blush to spread across Fiona's cheeks. Despite the light-hearted moment, the elf's anxiety soon returned in full force. Clasping her hands together in a desperate, trembling prayer, she begged the great spirits and Lord Luknuvis for the trap to work, terrified of a misfire. Beside her, Mayho watched with a sweat drop, noting that her friend was practically steaming with stress. Interrupting the frantic prayers, her companion held up a glowing smartphone screen, announcing that only 15 seconds remained. With a moment of truth at hand, they huddled together, eyes glued to the digital numbers as they began the final countdown. 10, 9. Beyond the heavy iron doors, the massive reptilian beast slumbered peacefully as the seconds ticked away. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. Suddenly, a deep rumble echoed through the chamber, and a single, colossal reptilian eye snapped open in the darkness. Unaware of the monster's sudden awakening, the girls watched the screen hit its final digits. 3, 2, 1, 0. A deafening roar, followed instantly by a cataclysmic shockwave, violently rattled the heavy iron doors. The sheer force of the blast sent a tremor through the stone floor, causing both girls to flinch and gasp in shock. As thick smoke began to hiss from the edges of the sealed entrance, the elf hesitantly asked if they should open it to check their handiwork. Her friend quickly shot the idea down, noting that while the structural integrity held, the chamber beyond was currently a suffocating, oxygen-deprived hellscape. She further explained the deadly physics of the situation, warning that introducing fresh air now would trigger a massive backdraft, engulfing them in a sea of flames. Though clearly struggling to grasp the complex science, her companion nodded in solemn agreement, willing to wait. Standing in the quiet aftermath within the vast, cavernous corridor, the dark-haired girl looked around the ancient stone architecture. A new, perplexing thought crossed her mind as she quietly pondered how this deep underground labyrinth was even supplied with breathable air in the first place. She reasoned that without the dungeon's unnatural ventilation, they would have suffocated long ago. It was simply another inexplicable rule of this alternate world. That same biological necessity applied to the colossal beast trapped behind the heavy doors. Its deep, rhythmic snoring was proof that it too relied on breathing. Even if the initial blast hadn't killed the creature, the true, suffocating nature of her strategy was finally in motion. A confident smile spread across her face as she gripped her device, posing the ultimate question. Could the mighty bee survive in a completely oxygen-deprived environment? Beside her, Fiona trembled, dizzy and overwhelmed by the sheer ruthlessness of the tactic. Deep within the sealed chamber, the massive reptilian head lay motionless amidst the shattered debris and broken pipes, trapped in the suffocating void. Deep within the subterranean abyss, the great dragon existed without a past. It possessed no memories of a time before the cold stone walls that surrounded it. Its entire existence began the very moment the sprawling dungeon was completed, instilled with a singular, unyielding mission. It rested before the massive iron gates, waiting patiently to face any mighty warriors who might breach the threshold with the full, terrifying extent of its power. As a low rumble echoed through the cavernous chamber, the beast pondered the endless stretch of its confinement, wondering just how much time had slipped away in the dark. Its sharp, slitted eyes snapped open, immediately detecting the presence of intruders, even though the great doors remained sealed. Standing far across the vast hall were the very first life forms it had ever encountered besides itself. Two fragile beings so insignificant that a mere exhale from its nostrils could obliterate them. Dismissing the girls as mere small animals, the Leviathan decided they were not the strong warriors it was destined to fight. However, its curiosity was piqued as the dark-haired human began arranging strange, metallic containers on the stone floor. Drawing upon its innate knowledge, the creature rationalized the bizarre behavior. It understood that the weak often presented offerings to appease the strong, and assumed this pathetic display was exactly that. 11 hours drifted by in silence before the beast was suddenly startled by a loud, mechanical whirring. A massive industrial fan now sat before it, its large blades spinning rapidly to push a powerful current of air across the chamber. Confusion washed over the monster as a foul, acrid stench began to drift on the artificial wind, filling its nostrils. It questioned if this noxious odor was truly meant to be attributed. It tried to dismiss the rising unease, reasoning that such insignificant creatures couldn't possibly be launching an attack. Yet the oppressive, sickening feeling in the air steadily thickened around it. Unaware of the true danger, the dragon braced itself for combat, just as the two girls gleefully counted down the final seconds on a glowing device, shouting in unison as the timer hit 0. She braced herself as the countdown hit 0, and in that exact moment, a blinding flash and a deafening roar consumed the chamber beyond the door. 10 days passed since the devastating blast. While Fiona lazily lounged on the floor, Mayho carried a bag of kibble, suggesting it was finally time to open the door and check the aftermath. Muttering about her companion's laziness, she poured dinner for the fluffy dog waiting eagerly at her feet. During their long wait, She had taken it upon herself to care for the pet corner survivors, giving them names. The fluffy dog became Pochi, the cat Tama, the lizard Kaiser, and the arowana fish Arrow. She had also kept busy tending to the store's plants. Meanwhile, Fiona had developed a fascination with car videos on a tablet. Watching her, Mayho realized that the elf had somehow gained the ability to understand their language, even if she wasn't fully conscious of the change. Pondering this strange phenomenon, she stretched her arms high above her head. She could only guess that their seamless communication was just another inexplicable quirk of being pulled into this fantasy situation. Putting the mystery aside, the two finally stood before the massive stone doors of the dungeon chamber. She asked if there was any movement inside, but Fiona, pressing close, confirmed that she couldn't hear a single sound from beyond the heavy gates. Reaching out, she grasped the large metal ring of the door. Fiona, trembling and clinging tightly to her arm, explained that the gate was sealed by magic, and, for some unknown reason, only Mayho possessed the ability to unlock it. Before turning the handle, she checked a digital gas meter, relieved to see the oxygen levels were normal and the air was safe. Though terrified of the battle that might await them, she steeled her nerves, knowing they had no other choice but to proceed. With a heavy groan, the massive doors swung open, revealing a scene of absolute devastation. The once grand chamber was reduced to a cratered wasteland of shattered stone and lingering smoke. Staring wide-eyed at the destruction, she hesitantly called out, wondering if the beast had perished. Deep within the ruins, the colossal Dragon King lay pinned beneath massive stone pillars. Its eyes were blank and lifeless, its formidable armored body completely crushed by the sheer force of the explosion and the collapsing ceiling. Despite the crushing weight of the rubble, the colossal beast clung to life. Fiona stared at the wreckage, her voice trembling as she realized it was still breathing. Mayho blinked in disbelief, questioning if her companion was absolutely certain. She quickly reasoned that if the creature had perished, its body would have already dissolved into magic crystals. The sheer mass of scales and flesh remaining before them confirmed the grim truth. The monstrous reptile was barely holding on, hovering on the very edge of death. Whether it was the immense pressure of the collapse, the searing heat, the grievous wounds, or simply the lack of oxygen, something had finally broken its legendary endurance. Hoping to end the threat once and for all, the dark-haired girl turned to instruct her companion to deliver the final strike with her blade. However, she found herself speaking to empty air, her words trailing off as she realized she was standing alone. A sudden shout echoed from the stairwell as the elven warrior came sprinting down the steps. Her arms were burdened with two heavy, sloshing buckets, and her face was set in a look of frantic determination. Screaming for her friend to clear the path, she charged headlong toward the pinned beast. With a fierce battle cry demanding the creature's demise, she prepared to unleash the contents of the buckets directly onto its massive snout. She urged her companion to help force the poison down the monster's throat, though Mayho quickly noted the beast wasn't even drawing breath to swallow the deadly concoction she had brewed. Desperation fueled the elf's frantic actions. She argued they had no other weapons at their disposal and needed to act swiftly before the creature could heal itself with restoration magic. Mayho could only stare, utterly bewildered by the chaotic, improvised assault. She stared at the empty metal buckets clattering against the stone floor, doubting the effectiveness of a topical application. However, her companion remained stubbornly confident, insisting the deadly brew would inflict continuous damage. Before their astonished eyes, the colossal form of the beast began to rapidly darken, its scales turning a necrotic black before fracturing and dissolving into a shower of glowing magic crystals. As the colossal creature finally dissolved into nothingness, a stunned silence fell over the cavern. Mayho stared wide-eyed at the empty space, stammering in sheer disbelief. Beside her, Fiona covered her mouth with a trembling hand, her voice barely a whisper as she struggled to process that they had actually won. Overjoyed, Fiona throws her arms around Mayho, pulling her into a tight embrace. She cheers triumphantly, her face flushed with excitement as she declares that they actually managed to defeat the dragon. Pulling back from the hug, the dark-haired girl stares in disbelief at the spot where the beast fell. She notes that instead of leaving a corpse, it has shattered into a massive pile of magic crystals, a fact her companion eagerly confirms. She realizes aloud that the monster didn't turn into a statue after all. Beside her, the swordswoman is already lost in a daydream, drooling over the sheer volume of crystals and muttering about how much they could buy with such a bounty. Gathering an armful of the glowing stones, the elf-eared girl generously offers her friend a share, suggesting she take a bunch since they sell for a high price. Watching her eagerly negotiate the percentage down from half to 10%, Mayho can't help but wonder if her new ally is actually completely broke. Deciding the logistics are too complicated, she points out that they don't understand the true value of the loot and can't carry it all anyway, suggesting they just move on. The practical decision leaves her companion visibly deflated, whining softly in disappointment. Despite the decision to leave the hoard behind, the dark-haired girl pauses to examine one of the large, faceted gems in her hand. With a small sigh of regret, acknowledging that it feels like a waste, she tosses the crystal aside. As they walk away, she brings up another concern, wondering why she didn't experience any sort of level up or dungeon acclimatization after defeating such a massive foe. She theorizes that because she didn't attack the beast directly, the system might have considered it cheating, denying her any experience points. The lack of a power boost becomes painfully obvious as the pair begins a steep ascent. While her companion bounds up the stone steps with ease, Mayho struggles far behind, her face drenched in sweat as she gasps for air, overwhelmed by the physical toll of the climb. Panting heavily, she complains about the grueling round trips and asks if there are any save points to make the journey easier. The swordswoman explains that while there are no save points, there are teleportation monuments that act as safe zones free of monsters, allowing travel between floors. This revelation sparks a sudden realization for the elf-eared girl, who notes with relief that finding one of those monuments means they can finally escape the dungeon without having to clear every single floor. Hearing this, Mayho falls silent, a bead of sweat rolling down her cheek as she processes the implications of their situation. She glanced back, noticing her companion's sudden hesitation. Fiona looked away, her voice dropping to a quiet murmur of reluctant agreement. Pushing past the uncertainty, they opened the heavy double doors ahead, stepping into a blindingly bright cavern. A lush, overgrown field of exotic flora stretched out before them, drawing an odd gasp from the dark-haired girl. She eagerly stepped forward to admire what looked like a beautiful flower garden, but her companion's sharp warning stopped her in her tracks. The elf's expression hardened with alarm as she recognized the deceptive vegetation. She quickly explained the deadly nature of the hydro weeds surrounding them. A mere brush against their leaves was enough to induce total body paralysis, and cutting them down was useless, as the resilient plants would instantly revive. Staring out across the impassable field, she admitted they were at a severe disadvantage. Without access to powerful flame magic to incinerate the weeds completely, their path forward seemed entirely blocked. Hearing this grim assessment, Mayho simply smirked, her confidence returning in full force. She playfully dismissed the swordswoman's concerns about lacking magical firepower, a mischievous glint in her eye. She confidently declared that while magic might be the standard solution in a dungeon, they possessed a far superior advantage: unlimited access to the modern tools of a home improvement center. Against such an arsenal, she boasted, mere poisonous plants stood no chance. True to her word, she materialized a massive, kerosene-fueled weed burner, strapped it on, and unleashed a roaring torrent of mundane fire upon the garden. As she gleefully sterilized the path, she instructed her terrified companion to hold onto a safety rope, just in case the paralysis took hold. Her fiery rampage was suddenly interrupted by a strange sensation. She paused, her eyes widening in mild surprise above her protective mask as she noticed something unexpected. She casually scratched at her side, complaining of a mild itch and wondering aloud if it was the dreaded poison taking effect. Trailing behind on the safety rope, Fiona watched in utter bewilderment, pointing out that despite the supposed paralysis, her friend was still walking perfectly fine. She listened as Fiona, still wearing her protective mask, noted that her whole body felt hot and admitted she might have been careless. Mayho, looking slightly confused, asked if that wasn't just the dungeon acclimatization taking effect. The realization suddenly hit her. Since the hydro weeds were akin to monsters, destroying them meant she was leveling up. Her eyes widened with excitement as she cheered, while Fiona, still recovering, could only offer a weak confirmation. Eager to share the spoils, she turned back to her companion, offering the weed burner and asking if she wanted to turn. Fiona politely declined, insisting that Mayho should gather as much acclimatization as possible. With that settled, she declared her intention to claim all the experience in the area, unleashing another roaring blast of fire from the burner. The flames quickly did their work, leaving the stone chamber completely clear of the deadly flora. She lowered the burner with a satisfied sigh, admiring the nice and tidy space, while Fiona watched in sheer amazement at how easily the task was accomplished. Fiona praised her reliability, noting how impressive it was that she hadn't missed a single tiny magic crystal among the ashes. She humbly brushed off the compliment, insisting once again that the credit belonged entirely to the home center's tools, not her own skills. As an afterthought, they had deliberately left a small cluster of the hydro weeds intact in the corner of the room, reasoning that the plants might prove useful later and could always be burned easily if necessary. With the room secured, they approached the heavy, arched wooden door leading deeper into the dungeon. She enthusiastically called out to keep moving forward, though a nervous groan escaped her lips as the heavy gates creaked open. The moment they stepped through, a wave of intense fatigue washed over her, forcing her to collapse against the stone wall, panting heavily. Fiona, alarmed by the sudden drop in energy, wondered if it was a delayed reaction to the acclimatization or just a teasing act, offering to carry her back to rest. She stubbornly refused, insisting they at least take a look inside. As she tried to push herself up, her hand trembled weakly against the cold stone floor. She stared at it in confusion, wondering what was happening to her body, having mistakenly believed the acclimatization had turned her into a superhuman. Pushing past her sudden wave of exhaustion, she leaned forward as the heavy door slid open. Beside her, Fiona mirrored her wide-eyed confusion. They both peered into the unknown space, murmuring in quiet surprise at what lay beyond. The light from the corridors spilled forward, casting their long, stretched shadows across the floor of the new chamber. The space ahead was a void of absolute darkness, prompting a hushed whisper that the room was completely pitch black. Mayho and Fiona stood before the gaping maw of the underground passage, the darkness inside absolute. Mayho peered into the gloom, noting the pitch-black conditions. Unfazed by the shadows, the elf confidently raised her hands, conjuring a glowing sphere of light magic between her palms. The younger girl watched in awe, marveling at how much the situation finally felt like a true fantasy adventure. However, the brilliant sphere sputtered and vanished almost instantly, leaving them in the dark once more. Her confident smile melted into a dismayed grimace, while her companion blinked in surprise. She quickly realized their predicament, explaining that they had stumbled into a specific type of area where magical light was instantly nullified. Hearing this, the teenager crossed her arms, wondering aloud how they were supposed to proceed without visibility. The young girl pondered their options, quickly dismissing the idea of using traditional torches. She reasoned that holding a torch would leave them with one less hand available for combat, a dangerous disadvantage in the unknown depths. A sudden burst of inspiration hit her, and she confidently declared that the solution was simple. They just needed a more powerful, non-magical light source. She assured her skeptical companion that she knew exactly where to get one. Deciding it was best to regroup, she suggested they head back for the day, noting they hadn't taken a break yet. She also expressed a keen curiosity about how her body would react once she fully adjusted to the dungeon's environment. Their retreat was swift but eventful, involving a brief skirmish where she aggressively fended off small, spiky creatures before they finally made it back to the familiar safety of the home center. By the next morning, the quiet atmosphere of the store was suddenly shattered by a loud, bewildered shout echoing from inside. The source of the commotion was the teenager herself, now dressed in a simple t-shirt and shorts, staring in absolute shock as she effortlessly hoisted a full-sized bicycle above her head with a single hand. Sitting calmly nearby, the elf explained that this sudden surge in physical strength was the result of the dungeon's acclimatization taking effect, suggesting they visit a temple to properly check her new capabilities. She swung her arms through the air with newfound vigor, a wide, eager grin spreading across her face. Thrilled by her sudden surge in strength, she boasted that she could finally wield weapons properly and slice right through the monsters on the lower floors. Watching her shadow box, Fiona offered a hesitant nod of agreement, channeling that enthusiasm into their immediate problem. The energetic teenager proudly presented a massive, balloon-like apparatus mounted on a sturdy tripod. As she declared it their solution for the dark zone, her elven companion stared at the strange contraption, utterly bewildered as to how they were supposed to use it. Surveying the bulky setup taking up space in the room, Fiona guessed it might be some sort of bizarre fencing training tool. Amused, her friend corrected her, explaining that it was actually heavy-duty lighting equipment, far beyond anything meant for an average home. She patted the large, rounded bulb, detailing that it was a specialized LED light used for outdoor construction sites, carrying a hefty price tag. However, she confidently assured her companion that it would provide ample illumination, and since they had an infinite supply at their disposal, they could simply overwhelm the darkness with sheer numbers. With a sharp click, the device flared to life, casting a brilliant, blinding white glow against the rough, jagged stone walls of the dungeon. Back in the oppressive gloom of the dark zone, the single balloon light carved out a safe, illuminated radius around the two adventurers. While the teenager noted the limits of a single bulb's reach, the elf marveled at the sheer intensity of the glow, admitting that not even high-level magicians could conjure such a powerful light. Encouraged, they decided to keep placing them along their path. As they ventured deeper, leaving a trail of glowing beacons behind them, the seasoned warrior kept a vigilant watch. She sternly warned her younger companion not to let her guard down, cautioning that even though the path seemed clear of monsters, the unseen darkness could still hide deadly traps. Unfazed by the warning, the girl flashed a carefree smile, casually holding another light fixture. She breezily promised to be careful and check their surroundings as they moved forward. Her confidence shattered in an instant. A massive, unblinking eye materialized in the pitch-black void directly above her, just as the rocky ground beneath her sneakers gave way with a violent crack. As she plummeted into the sudden chasm, her companion lunged forward with a desperate scream, reaching out to catch her. Heart pounding, the teenager dangled precariously over the dark abyss, her arm gripped tightly by the elf, who lay sprawled on her stomach at the edge of the cliff. Panting heavily from the exertion and the scare, the rescuer breathlessly scolded her for not listening, while the dangling girl could only offer a meek, trembling apology. She sat safely on the edge, letting out a heavy sigh of relief as she admitted that true terror had stolen her voice. Staring down into the seemingly bottomless abyss, she noted that it was far too large to be a simple pitfall, making a direct descent impossible. Glancing back, she quickly warned her companion to step away from the precarious ledge. Hearing the elf's amused question about her fear, the dark-haired girl grimaced, confessing that bottomless pits instinctively filled her with absolute dread. Flustered by her friend's teasing smile, she defensively declared that scary things were simply scary, insisting she was just a normal girl. Pouting at the implication that she was anything but ordinary, her complaints were abruptly cut short as the white-haired warrior suddenly gasped and pointed eagerly toward the darkness ahead. Following the pointed finger, They spotted narrow land bridges breaking up the massive chasm, deducing that a careful detour across the natural maze would be their only way forward. Confident once more, the dark-haired girl suggested they could easily construct a makeshift bridge, but her optimism faltered as she noticed a massive, imposing silhouette clinging to the distant rock. She guided her companion's eyes downward toward a suspiciously lumpy section of the cavern wall, revealing a gigantic, grotesque beast resembling a monstrous gecko anchored to the vertical stone. Without a second thought, she grabbed the elf by the waist and bolted, sprinting away from the ledge in a sheer, unadulterated panic. Safely hidden behind a cluster of rocks, she breathlessly defended her sudden retreat, estimating the beast to be at least 5 meters long and warning that it would undoubtedly devour them if they tried to cross. Catching her breath, she adopted a serious expression, reasoning that they needed to eliminate the monster from their current vantage point rather than fighting it directly on the treacherous bridges. Her unseen attack found its mark, sending the massive, lumpy beast plummeting into the dark abyss below with an echoing shriek. Peering over the edge, she and Fiona erupted into cheers, clasping hands in a triumphant celebration. Fiona exclaimed that their plan had worked perfectly, while her companion laughed, admitting a brief moment of doubt before their resounding success. Clasping her hands together in a mock prayer, she offered a cheeky apology to the fallen creature. She expressed a feigned regret for ending the life of such a remarkable beast, justifying the act as a mere necessity for their own survival. But how had they managed such a feat? The answer lay in the events that unfolded a short time prior, back within the quiet confines of the store's pet corner and its restricted staff room. Donning a pair of novelty glasses complete with a thick, fake mustache, Mayho strikes a confident pose. She declares that their best course of action is the slippery, smooth strategy. She holds up a thick volume titled Ecology and Breeding of Reptiles, explaining that while she considered several options, this approach would be the fastest. Behind her, Fiona tilts her head, clearly puzzled by the cryptic name of the plan. The white-haired warrior listens intently as Mayho elaborates on the science of gecko feet, detailing how microscopic hairs create a binding force that allows them to scale sheer walls. If the giant beast they face relies on that same principle, they can exploit it. Grasping the basic concept, she hoists 2 heavy jugs of motor oil, suggesting they simply douse the creature to make it lose its grip. Mayho immediately shoots down the idea, exasperatedly calling her companion a musclehead for such a blunt approach. Instead, the teenager leads them down a hardware aisle lined with long, white PVC pipes. She explains that a direct assault might agitate the monster, so they need a stealthier method, pointing to the plastic tubing as their primary weapon. Examining the proposed weapon, Fiona hefts one of the hollow tubes, noting its light weight with a distinctly unimpressed hum. Mayho winces at the lackluster reaction, quickly clarifying that they will connect the pipes to safely pour the oil from a distance. Defensive, she admits the plan is boring, rambling about a much flashier, discarded idea involving a tower of high-voltage washing machines. She justifies scrapping it due to the noise, leaving her companion to wonder why she seems so frustrated by her own sensible choice. She grumbles under her breath, her face scrunched up in a comical display of annoyance at having to abandon the more explosive strategy. Breaking the tension, Fiona's voice echoes softly down the vast hardware aisle. She praises her friend's vast knowledge, amazed that amidst countless unfamiliar tools, the teenager knows exactly what to use and how to apply it. The sincere compliment catches the teenager off guard, her eyes widening in surprise as the swordswoman smiles warmly, calling her truly reliable. She beamed with renewed confidence, playfully boasting that while she didn't know everything, she probably knew about 90%. Relieved to see her companion back to her usual self, Fiona agreed as they enthusiastically decided to put their plan into action. The preparation began immediately. They connected the PVC pipes, extending them to the necessary length, and carefully wrapped the joints in soft sponge to muffle any sound. Moving to the next phase, they gathered their equipment. Mayho explained they would store the motor oil in large drums and extract it using hand pumps. When Fiona asked about the required quantity, Mayho estimated they would need about 5 200-liter drums, admitting the heavy lifting would be a grueling task. However, the physical burden proved surprisingly light. Thanks to their recent physical acclimatization, they carried the massive, sloshing drums down the brick corridor with effortless ease, a testament to their growing strength. Arriving at their destination, they worked quietly above the slumbering giant gecko. They carefully extended the silence pipes outward like support beams directly over the beast, then filled the drums with oil and primed the pumps. To ensure stability, they secured the makeshift pipeline. Using thick rope, they lashed the pipes to heavy car tires, anchoring the entire contraption to prevent it from shifting or collapsing during the operation. As a final precaution, they incorporated Fiona's backup strategy. Using a large syringe, they meticulously filled a cluster of water balloons with the slippery motor oil, creating a stockpile of ultimate weapons just in case the primary trap failed. Stepping back, the duo surveyed their completed handiwork. The drums, pumps, and pipes sat ready in the dim light, prompting a satisfied confirmation that their trap was finally set. Their tension broke slightly as Fiona teased her partner about a near-disastrous sneeze during the setup, to which Mayho defensively blamed uncontrollable physiological phenomena. Below them, The monstrous gecko remained completely motionless, seemingly oblivious to the threat looming from the direction of the exit. With their preparations complete and their nerves steadied, they exchanged a final, resolute confirmation. A hand hovered over the mechanism, and with a decisive shout, they activated the trap. She watched as the thick, viscous oil began to flow, bubbling out of the makeshift pipeline and cascading down the rocky cavern wall in heavy, dark streams. The slick fluid rained down directly onto the slumbering giant gecko, coating its lumpy, textured hide in a thick, dripping layer of sludge, yet the beast remained perfectly still. Observing its lack of reaction through her binoculars, she noted that the creature hadn't even flinched. She reasoned that the beast likely wouldn't stir unless directly provoked or presented with prey, deciding they should hold their position and wait just a bit longer. Her companion, noticing their primary supply was depleted, asked if they should tap into the reserves. She quickly rejected the idea, pointing out that the monster was already thoroughly drenched. Having come this far, it was time to launch a direct assault. She eagerly declared it was time to unleash their ultimate weapon, grabbing a handful of oil-filled balloons. With a determined battle cry to start throwing, her elven partner enthusiastically agreed, readying her own ammunition. They hurled the heavy projectiles with all their enhanced might, sending a barrage of balloons smashing against the cavern wall and the creature's thick scales, bursting on impact to add even more slick fluid to the beast's resting place. The relentless bombardment finally took its toll, causing the creature's massive, clawed foot to lose its grip on the heavily lubricated stone, sending it sliding downward with a sudden, confused jolt. As it slipped, the girls realized their tactic was working. Seizing the opportunity, the swordswoman launched another projectile with pinpoint accuracy, scoring a direct hit right over the monster's large, slitted eye. Her precise strike, however, had an unintended consequence. The beast's claws dug furiously into the rock to halt its fall, and a chilling realization washed over the two girls as they noticed the creature's gaze locked directly onto their position. They screamed in sheer terror as the massive reptile lunged forward with terrifying speed, its jaws unhinged in a deafening roar, forcing the elf to frantically draw her blade as the monster closed the distance. She watched in breathless anticipation as the massive beast's claws finally lost their grip on the slick, oil-drenched stone. With a sickening scrape, the giant gecko plummeted into the darkness below, accompanied by the glowing form of their canine companion diving fearlessly after it. The creature let out a deafening, monstrous shriek that echoed through the cavern as it tumbled helplessly into the bottomless abyss. Peering over the edge, the elf girl breathed a sigh of relief, wondering if they were finally safe. Beside her, Mayho stared at her own trembling hand, a sudden, strange sensation washing over her. Clenching her fist, Mayho gasped as a sudden heat flared within her, her body feeling as though it were on fire. She quickly realized what was happening. The intense sensation was the acclimatization process, undeniable proof that the monstrous beast had been officially defeated. The realization dawned on both of them simultaneously, their eyes meeting as the gravity of their survival set in. A wide grin broke across Mayho's face, and she let out a triumphant laugh. She admitted to Fiona that she had been terrified for a moment, but their desperate, slippery trap had worked like an absolute charm. Their celebration was cut short by a sudden, heavy rumbling that shook the stone beneath their feet, causing both girls to jump in surprise. Across the vast, empty expanse of the cavern, the dust settled to reveal a heavy, arched door that had materialized on the far wall. Fiona stared at the new exit in disbelief, confessing that she had never heard of such a thing happening in this dungeon. Mayho, still riding the high of their victory, suggested that the giant gecko might have been a hidden boss they needed to defeat to unlock the path forward. With a deep, resonant groan, the massive wooden doors slowly swung open, banishing the cavern's shadows with a blinding, ethereal light. The room of darkness had been conquered, and the path to the next floor lay wide open before them. As they navigated the treacherous stone path, Fiona reached out, her gloved hand guiding her companion away from a dangerous fissure in the floor. Grateful for the warning, Mayho carefully stepped over the hazard. She recounted the absurd trials they had already faced, listing off the pitch-black maze, the massive man-eating gecko, and the field of regenerating poisonous plants with a tone of disbelief. Concluding her summary, she declared the dungeon's design went beyond mere malice, calling it downright brutish. Beside her, the elf tilted her head, genuinely puzzled by the specific choice of words. Answering the dark-haired girl's question about whether defeated monsters return, the elf reassured her. She explained that while lesser creatures constantly welled up from the depths, the exceptionally strong ones were gone for good once slain. Despite the elf's warning that such unique beasts were usually incredibly difficult to defeat, the memory of her companion effortlessly dispatching the giant dragon and the grotesque gecko suggested otherwise. Relieved, the dark-haired girl expressed gratitude that they wouldn't have to face those specific nightmares again. Pushing her weight against a heavy set of wooden doors, she admitted that dealing with an endless swarm of weaklings sounded far more tedious than fighting a single boss. Her elven guide murmured a quiet prayer, hoping they could avoid a direct confrontation with any infinite hordes. As the heavy doors swung open, both of them stopped dead in their tracks, their eyes widening in sheer awe at the unexpected sight that lay before them. Above a dark, still expanse of water, countless jagged stalactites hung from the cavernous ceiling like the teeth of a massive, slumbering beast. The underground lake stretched out into the gloom, illuminated by faint, ethereal light reflecting off the crystalline formations. Taking in the surreal landscape, Mayho muttered that this dungeon truly defied all logic, while Fiona, though captivated by its beauty, sensed an underlying threat. Her gaze locked onto the center of the lake, where a single, distinct ripple disturbed the glassy surface, confirming her suspicion that something was lurking beneath the dark water. She listened in confusion as her companion inquired about boats. Admitting her store only stocked inflatables that would easily sink, she wondered if they should just press forward. Mayho, however, shook her head, declaring she had a surefire, albeit time-consuming, method to cross. The grand plan was finally revealed. They were going to drain the entire underground lake. The sheer absurdity of the idea sent a shockwave through the elf, causing her to shriek in utter disbelief. Still reeling, she demanded to know if her friend was serious. Unfazed, the dark-haired girl reasoned that they conveniently had a lower level to dump the water into, flatly refusing to deal with the hazards of a flooded environment. Retreating to the safety of the massive hardware store, they strolled down the brightly lit aisles. The dark-haired girl mused that every new discovery seemed to send them right back to their sanctuary, a sentiment her companion readily agreed with, relieved by the lack of threats lurking above. Her mind raced with the potential dangers of the flooded cavern, imagining aquatic beasts armed with tridents ambushing them from the depths. Acknowledging the unpredictable nature of the dungeon's water source, she resolved that their only option was to execute their drainage plan and hope for the best. Gathering the necessary equipment, she hoisted a heavy water pump into her arms. She noted that they could easily power the machinery by repurposing the generators they had left behind in the beast lair. The logistical challenge, she explained, was the sheer distance from the cavern entrance to the water's surface, a drop of nearly 30 meters. To bridge the gap, they gathered thick, pressure-resistant hoses and sturdy coils of rope to secure the new pump. Recalling the elf's incredible feat of strength against the giant reptile, she handed over the heavy machinery, assigning her the crucial task of hurling the pump into the lake. The swordswoman blinked in surprise, pointing to herself as she processed the heavy responsibility. While her companion began swinging the tethered pump to build momentum, the dark-haired girl meticulously secured the hoses with tight bands to prevent any leaks. She expertly linked multiple sections together with couplers, extending their makeshift pipeline to a massive length. The final step required careful attention to the electrical components. She spliced extension cords together, filling any vulnerable gaps with corking material before wrapping the entire connection tightly in waterproof tape, proudly declaring their drainage system complete and ready for action. She stood before the vast, silent expanse of the underground lake, watching a single drop of condensation ripple the dark surface. Turning to her companion, Mayho handed over the heavy pump mechanism. She instructed the elf to hurl it into the water with all her might, knowing they needed to reach a good depth to start. Fiona confidently accepted the task, gripping the device tightly. With a powerful swing, the elf launched the pump. It tore through the air with incredible speed, crashing into the distant water with a resounding splash. Impressed by the sheer force, Mayho cheered. She quickly grabbed the trailing hose, explaining that while the pump itself lacked the strength to lift water very high, they had a clever workaround. She detailed the science behind their plan, the siphon effect. As long as the pump could push the water up just enough to fill the hose once, gravity would take over. The hose led 100 meters down the stairs to the Gecko's chamber, ensuring the water would continue to flow downwards entirely on its own. A sudden vibration in her hands confirmed her theory. Feeling the liquid surge upward, she noted that they would start by draining the shallow depths, moving the pump deeper only after the continuous flow was established. The thick hose snaked its way down the winding stone staircase, passing through the heavy iron ring door and disappearing into the depths below. Far below, the water gushed steadily from the end of the line. Observing the successful drainage, Mayho suggested they build a few more identical setups to increase their overall efficiency. With multiple hoses now pulsing with the steady rhythm of flowing water, she stepped back, satisfied. The system was fully operational, and all that remained was to let time do the work. Deciding to make the most of the wait, Mayho proposed they eat lunch near the door, keeping a safe distance in case they needed to escape quickly while monitoring the pumps. Fiona's eyes lit up at the mention of food, eagerly asking if they were having the rice balls she loved so much. She clasped her hands together in gratitude before a lavish bento box, the neatly packed rice balls and side dishes looking incredibly appetizing. Marveling at the meal, the elf noted with surprise that the food was still perfectly warm despite the time that had passed. Beside her, Mayho happily agreed, pointing out how much more convenient her world's items were compared to this one. A brief silence settled between them before the swordswoman spoke up again, her tone shifting as she admitted there was something she had been meaning to ask. Turning her gaze directly toward her companion, she asked the lingering question. Did Mayho want to return to the world she came from? The dark-haired girl paused, her cheerful demeanor fading as she looked down, genuinely pondering the idea of going back. Suddenly, she snapped her head up with a bright, dismissive smile, declaring that she didn't really want to go back, at least not right now. The abrupt answer caught the elf completely off guard. She elaborated on her reasoning, listing the obstacles in her way. She pointed out that they had no leads. The wish-granting jewel seemed unusable, and there wasn't even a clear objective like defeating a demon lord to trigger her return. Waving her hands dismissively, she concluded that as long as she was alive, she would figure it out, making survival their top priority. Hearing this, the elf lowered her head in guilt, apologizing and blaming herself for the entire situation, though her companion remained completely unbothered. Trying to lift her spirits, the girl from another world confessed that using her home center abilities here was actually fun, and having her around made things far from dull. The heartfelt admission brought a surprise blush to the swordswoman's cheeks, even as her friend casually mused about becoming an adventurer once they finally escaped the dungeon. Grounding her friend's lofty ambitions, she gently pointed out a few glaring issues. The girl had never actually fought a monster in a proper battle, nor did she possess any form of citizenship in this world. She listened quietly as her companion pondered the logistics of leaving. Mayho reasoned that if they did escape, she would need to gather valuable items from her own world to sell at a premium just to survive. The dark-haired girl's confidence quickly wavered. A grim scenario played out in her mind, being branded a dangerous foreigner from another world and subjected to a brutal witch hunt before she could even establish herself. Brushing off the morbid thought with a casual smile, she declared that if things got too difficult, she would simply live in the dungeon permanently. The elf stared back, utterly bewildered by the casual suggestion. Leaning in closer, the swordswoman pressed for an explanation, genuinely baffled as to why anyone would choose such a life. Her friend tapped her chin, considering the question carefully. Staring up at the cold, stone ceiling, she explained her reasoning. It wasn't a lack of desire to leave, but rather the very real danger of the outside world. As an outsider, she knew she wouldn't be welcomed with open arms. The elf's expression softened into one of deep concern. Hesitantly, she asked if her companion was truly okay with abandoning the prospect of having a family or a normal life. The question caught her completely off guard. She blinked in confusion as the topic shifted to marriage and dating, noting the stark cultural differences between them. She awkwardly admitted that she had long outgrown the desire to date boys, though she quickly added that she could if she wanted to. Looking out over the vast, empty cavern, she finally dropped the facade. With a quiet sigh, she confessed that she was just putting on airs, admitting she had never actually dated anyone either. A mischievous glint suddenly appeared in her eyes. Leaning in with a playful smirk, she teased the flustered elf, declaring that if she were a guy, she would have definitely tried to woo someone as cute as her. The swordswoman erupted into a blushing, flailing mess, demanding she stop poking fun. Laughing off the reaction, the dark-haired girl finally conceded, promising that she would at least try to make a living in the outside world before giving up entirely. She clarified her situation, explaining that since she was still just a student, she had no idea if she'd even be able to find work. Fiona leaned in, her eyes wide with surprise at the revelation that her companion attended a school, assuming such institutions were reserved for royalty. Mayho quickly waved her hands, dismissing the notion. She went on to describe her homeland, noting that where she came from, attending school was something absolutely everyone did. Sitting side by side on the rocky ground, she asked if the elf had ever attended one. Fiona shook her head, her gaze dropping as she admitted that certain circumstances had prevented it. Hearing this, Mayho realized that schools did, in fact, exist in this world as well. A sudden realization dawned on her. Recalling her companion's intense obsession with gathering magic crystals, she deduced that the issue wasn't a lack of interest, but a lack of funds. She silently resolved that they could simply sell the materials they had collected in the dungeon to cover the costs. Voicing her thoughts, she suggested that once they finally escaped the dungeon, Fiona should enroll. The elf hesitated, pointing out that she was already 15 years old, but her friend quickly reassured her that it was never too late to start learning. The reassurance caught the elf off guard. Her eyes widened slightly before her expression softened, and she reached out, gently clasping both of her friend's hands in her own. Holding on tightly, she leaned closer, her voice filled with a sudden, earnest hope as she asked if they could attend the school together. The request hit her like a physical blow, her eyes widening in sheer shock at the prospect of enrolling herself. Her mind raced with practical concerns, the potential need for a family register, the intimidatingly fancy nature of a magical academy, and her own general lack of enthusiasm for the idea. Yet, as she glanced back, her hesitation wavered. She found herself staring into a pair of wide, pleading eyes, the elf's gaze so full of vulnerable anticipation that it completely melted her resolve. With a soft sigh, she gave in, casually agreeing to go together since she didn't have any better plans anyway. The elf's face instantly lit up with pure, radiant joy at the confirmation. She sealed the pact by intertwining her pinky finger with her companions, cementing their shared promise for the future. 5 days later, the two girls stood side by side, their eyes wide with astonishment at the sight before them. They peered over the precipice of a massive, rocky chasm. The cavern, once completely submerged, had been entirely drained of its water, revealing a staggering, cavernous depth. Suddenly, the elf pointed toward the distant bottom, alerting her friend to a strange shape resting on the dry cavern floor. Down below, a massive, aquatic beast with draconic horns and large fins thrashed helplessly against the jagged rocks, gasping for breath in the dry air. Approaching the stranded creature, they debated its nature. While one marveled at its sheer size, wondering if it was merely a giant fish, the other deduced from its horns that it was likely a water serpent, a lesser breed of dragon. The seasoned warrior explained that under normal circumstances, such a beast would be a terrifying foe. However, stranded and suffocating, it was now nothing more than an easy opportunity to gain experience before the cavern flooded again. Seizing the advantage, the duo gathered an absurd arsenal of everyday items: axes, shovels, kitchen knives, and a jug of kerosene, and charged at the helpless monster with ruthless enthusiasm. As their makeshift weapons struck true, the dark-haired girl noted how fragile this creature was compared to the true dragon they had faced before. With a brief, unapologetic thought for the beast's suffering, she tossed a lit lighter toward the kerosene-soaked scales. The spark ignited instantly, engulfing the massive serpent in a roaring pillar of fire that quickly brought its thrashing to a final, agonizing halt. With the massive serpent finally defeated, Mayho cheered their victory, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the scattered magic crystals. She urged Fiona to gather them quickly, watching in amusement as her companion sprinted ahead with a bag, eager to collect the spoils. Observing the frantic gathering, she mused aloud about the elf's intense obsession with the glowing stones. Suddenly, a familiar, heavy sensation washed over her, signaling that the physical acclimatization from their hard-won experience was taking effect. She calculated that such a massive catch would surely yield a significant boost in her own strength. Her confident internal math was abruptly shattered by a sudden, startled yelp as something unexpected caught her off guard. Her shock stemmed from her companion, who was suddenly pointing frantically toward the far end of the cavern. Startled by the urgent outburst, she demanded to know what was wrong, her own eyes widening as she followed the trembling finger. Resting silently against the rocky cavern wall at the end of that invisible line sat a massive, iron-bound wooden treasure chest. Deep within the cavern, Mayho spotted a wooden box resting on the stone floor. She called out to Fiona, her voice echoing off the walls, announcing the discovery of a treasure chest. Her excitement quickly gave way to caution as she stared at the solitary object. She muttered her suspicions, wondering aloud if the enticing prize was actually a carefully laid trap. Remembering the harsh reality of their situation, she reasoned that Fiona had been banished to the lowest floor by a similar snare. Deciding the risk of explosions or poison needles was too great, she turned on her heel and declared they were ignoring it, leaving the elf utterly bewildered. The elf lunged forward, grabbing her friend's shoulders with desperate, flushed cheeks. She pleaded with her not to give up so easily, arguing that a chest found on the deepest floors could hold a legendary-class magic item. Unfazed by the outburst, the dark-haired girl calmly asked if her companion possessed any skills for disarming traps. When the elf admitted they would need a professional, she crouched beside the wooden box, realizing with a grunt of effort that it wasn't bolted to the floor and could be moved. A mischievous spark lit up her eyes as a plan formed in her mind. She quickly outlined her idea to fetch a belt sling, a rope hoist, and a large tripod, prompting a mix of awe and apprehension from her friend. Returning with the necessary equipment, the pair constructed a sturdy tripod over the prize. With careful, synchronized movements, they operated the winch, slowly hoisting the heavy wooden box into the air. The mechanical advantage of the pulley system made the heavy lifting effortless. She noted with satisfaction that securing the lid with a thick belt eliminated any risk of it springing open from a sudden jolt. Hauling their secured prize to the top of a steep, stone staircase, she finalized her unorthodox strategy. Since the dungeon's architecture was virtually indestructible and magic seals supposedly contained any triggered traps, her plan was simply to hurl the entire contraption down the steps. Her companion voiced a final, anxious concern, worrying that the violent descent might shatter valuable potions hidden inside. Brushing off the warning, she argued that losing a few potions was 100 times better than falling victim to a deadly snare, and she braced herself to push. She heaved the heavy wooden chest forward, sending it tumbling into the stairwell, and immediately slammed the heavy iron-studded doors shut behind it to block any potential blast. The wooden box clattered violently against the stone steps, bouncing and spinning as it plummeted into the depths. After a moment of silence, the two cautiously pushed the doors back open. Peering down the long staircase, the elf asked for an assessment. Her companion noted the lack of explosions or poison gas, suggesting they head down to investigate the aftermath. At the very bottom of the stairwell, the battered chest rested upside down on the cold floor, its lid now slightly ajar from the rough descent. Reaching the landing, the elf sighed, remarking that only her friend would go to such absurd lengths to transport a chest. Unfazed, the dark-haired girl celebrated their success, pointing out the complete absence of triggered traps as she eagerly prepared to reveal their prize. Nestled within the wooden confines was a surprisingly mundane object, a simple, unadorned leather satchel fastened with a single buckle. Disappointment washed over the girl as she lifted the plain bag, questioning if this was truly their grand reward. However, her companion's eyes widened with sudden intensity. Requesting to examine the item, the elf snatched it up, holding it close to her face in stunned silence. Without warning, the elf let out an ear-piercing shriek that echoed off the stone walls, causing her friend to flinch violently and stumble backward in sheer panic. Trembling from head to toe, the elf stammered, completely overwhelmed by her discovery. Recovering her composure, her dark-haired companion dryly asked if the sudden outburst was due to nicotine withdrawal, thoroughly unamused by the scare. Ignoring the sarcastic remark, the elf clutched the satchel tightly, her face flushed with manic excitement. She breathlessly explained that it was a legendary magical bag capable of holding countless items without adding weight. It was an artifact so incredibly rare that selling it could fund the construction of an entire castle, a treasure usually reserved only for royalty and elite explorers. Her staggering appraisal of the artifact sparked a realization in the dark-haired girl. She likened the magical bag to the mysterious, bottomless inventories found in video games, marveling at how it could store far more than realistically possible. As the elf's voice echoed, calling it an amazing treasure, the sheer absurdity of the situation finally hit her. She stared in wide-eyed disbelief, struggling to process that such a fantastical item actually existed, and that her friend had just casually worn it on her head moments before. Eager to test its limits, she grabbed a heavy, bright red fire extinguisher and began sliding it into the plain leather opening. To her absolute shock, the bulky metal cylinder vanished completely into the depths of the pouch without a single snag. Standing amidst the scattered boxes of the home center aisle, she continued to feed various supplies into the artifact. She marveled aloud at how it swallowed everything with room to spare, confirming it was indeed a crazy, invaluable treasure. A smug grin spread across her face as she calculated their newfound wealth, boldly declaring that selling it would fund a lifetime of lazy luxury. The elf immediately panicked, waving her hands frantically and protesting the very idea of selling such a rare artifact. Desperate to change her mind, the blonde warrior leaned in earnestly, insisting that since they discovered it together, they should share it and use it as a team. The dark-haired girl blinked in confusion, reminding her companion that she had previously been desperate for money. A shadow fell over the elf's eyes as she fell silent for a brief, heavy moment. Then, forcing a strained smile and a nervous laugh, she quickly deflected, suggesting they might find a teleportation monument on the next floor. Turning her back to hide her expression, she abruptly conceded the bag to her friend. She reasoned that she never would have found it alone, and that the dark-haired girl was far better equipped to utilize the strange tools they were gathering. Staring at her companion's retreating back, she felt a pang of concern. She tried to protest, pointing out the sudden change of heart, but the elf simply dismissed the matter, leaving a lingering, uneasy tension in the air. She hesitated, a bead of sweat forming on her cheek as she looked at her companion. Fiona, however, simply offered a warm, closed-eye smile, her hands clasped behind her back as she firmly insisted that the magical bag should remain with her friend. Relenting, the dark-haired girl accepted the offer, though a lingering, unspoken tension hung between them. Eager to dispel the awkwardness, she quickly changed the subject, pointing out that their future plans meant little until they actually managed to escape their current predicament. She suggested they take a brief rest before pressing forward. Her companion eagerly agreed, her voice trailing off and echoing slightly as they looked down the long, descending flight of stone stairs that awaited them in the gloom. Standing before the heavy wooden doors of the next floor, Mayho asked what their next move should be. Fiona hesitated, suggesting that if the upcoming challenges proved too difficult, they shouldn't force themselves to push forward. She continued, her hands clasped nervously, proposing that perhaps staying and living together in their current safe haven wouldn't be such a terrible fate. Mayho narrowed her eyes, immediately sensing that her companion was hiding something. The dark-haired girl realized this sudden timidity was entirely out of character. Not since their grueling battle with the dragon had the usually steadfast warrior acted so hesitant. Caught off guard by the scrutiny, the elf let out a flustered, panicked squeak, her eyes widening in alarm. Seeing her companion's distress, Mayho stepped closer with a reassuring smile, clarifying that settling down was strictly a last resort. She promised that if fear was holding her friend back, she would take the lead and handle whatever lay ahead, urging them to move forward together. She added a practical point, noting that staying trapped underground without sunlight would eventually drive them both crazy. Throwing her arms wide with renewed enthusiasm, she reasoned that logically, the enemy should become weaker the closer they got to the surface. She declared her absolute determination to clear the dungeon, regardless of how long it took. Buoyed by that resolve, the pair stepped through the heavy doorway into a vast, circular stone chamber. In the center of the room, an intricate, glowing magic circle dominated the floor. Staring at the glowing runes, the warrior noted with growing dread that it was not a teleportation monument. A sinister, oppressive magical energy radiated from the complex design. She immediately warned that they should retreat, but before the words fully left her mouth, the massive iron-reinforced doors slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash, sealing them inside. She gasped in shock, her eyes widening as a sudden burst of light erupted from the center of the ominous magic circle. Beside her, Mayho mirrored her alarm, bracing for whatever was about to emerge. From a swirling dark energy, two figures materialized, standing perfectly still. As the shadows dissipated, their features became clear. They were perfect, mirror-image copies of the two girls, right down to their clothing and weapons. The sight sent the swordswoman into a panic, stammering in disbelief at their own reflections. The dark-haired girl, however, quickly regained her composure, calmly deducing that these were doppelgangers and that their only way forward was to defeat them. As she analyzed their opponents, her sharp gaze locked onto a crucial detail on her own copy. She narrowed her eyes, scrutinizing the imposter's waistline. A confident smirk spread across her face as the realization dawned on her. Turning to her companion, she boldly declared that they could easily clear this floor. The elf remained hesitant, nervously pointing out the intimidating presence of her own evil twin standing across the stone chamber. Dismissing the concern, the dark-haired girl explained her strategy. While a fully equipped party might face a grueling battle of attrition against perfect copies, she noted that the room's magic had failed to replicate her specialized gear. With a triumphant grin, she hoisted a heavy, metallic canister, boasting that her true strength lay entirely in her items. Wasting no time, she strapped a heavy gas mask over her face, her voice muffled as she instructed her partner to charge in and slash the imposters to pieces while she provided backup. The vast, circular room echoed with the tension of the impending clash. Before the swordswoman could move, her masked companion offered one final, stern warning. She must not hold back just because the enemies wore their faces. Stealing her resolve, the elf nodded in agreement. With her hesitation banished, she lunged forward, the sharp ring of steel echoing through the chamber as she drew her blade to strike down her own reflection. She held her ground as her companion took the initiative. With a fierce battle cry, Mayho hurled the heavy metallic gas canister through the air, catching her imposter completely off guard. As the makeshift projectile spun toward their enemies, the imposter swordswoman glanced up, distracted for a crucial second. Seizing the opening, the real Fiona dashed forward, closing the distance in a blur of motion. Closing in on her target, she unleashed a powerful, sweeping strike with her blade, her sharp exhale cutting through the tension of the battlefield. Amidst the clash, the false Mayho scrambled backward. A sudden realization dawned on the clone. She possessed the same physical form, but lacked the specialized gear and weapons her original carried. Unaware of the clone's shifting tactics, Mayho cheered for her partner's successful strike. Her celebration was cut short by a frantic warning scream from Fiona, just as the imposter lunged directly at the defenseless girl. The imposter swung a heavy metal pipe, a wicked grin spreading across her face as she marveled at her own unexpected physical strength. Mayho barely managed to block the crushing blow, but the clone's triumph was short-lived. The makeshift weapon suddenly snapped under the immense pressure, replacing her confident smile with wide-eyed panic. As the disarmed clone stumbled backward in shock, Fiona sprinted in to cover her blind spot. Seeing the perfect opening, the real Mayho gripped her own sturdy baton, a fierce, confident smile returning to her face as she praised her partner's timing and prepared to counterattack. Without a second of hesitation, she brought the heavy baton crashing down toward her imposter. She roared a final declaration of victory, putting all her weight into the decisive, punishing blow. With a fierce cry declaring the end of the battle, Mayho delivers a devastating strike. The force of the blow connects squarely with her imposter, sending the doppelganger flying backward as its form begins to violently fracture. The false copy's face contorts in silent shock as the destructive energy consumes it. In an instant, the imposter's physical form completely shatters, dissolving into the air. As the dust settles, large, shimmering crystals rain down where the clone once stood. The victorious girl throws her arms up in a triumphant cheer, celebrating her perfect strike, while Fiona rushes toward her, calling out her name in relief. Reaching her companion, the elf frantically inspects her for injuries, worried that a stray fragment might have struck her. She apologizes for attacking something that looked exactly like her friend, but Mayho quickly waves off the concern with a bright smile, assuring her she is completely unharmed and actually grateful for the decisive action. Relieved, she shifts her attention to the glowing remnants scattered across the floor. She points out the valuable magic crystals left behind by their defeated foes, suggesting they gather the loot and proceed to the next floor while they still have the energy. However, her companion hesitates, staring down at the glittering stones near her sneakers with a troubled expression. Noticing the pause, the elf asks what is wrong, helpfully offering to provide a bag if she had forgotten to bring one. Misinterpreting the silence, she quickly backtracks, apologizing and volunteering to gather the crystals herself. Mayho simply stares back, a flicker of unease crossing her features at the sudden, overly accommodating shift in her friend's demeanor. Leaving the chamber behind, the pair begin the arduous ascent up a massive, winding stone staircase. The dark-haired girl groans, complaining that no matter how many times they do it, climbing these endless steps remains an exhausting chore. Glancing over her shoulder, she tries to lighten the mood, expressing her desperate hope that they will find a teleportation monument waiting for them just ahead. She calls back to her partner for agreement, expecting a familiar reply. But the elf offers no response, her eyes wide and completely vacant as she stares blankly ahead. Panic suddenly grips the young girl as she screams her friend's name, the sharp cry echoing off the cold stone walls. She finally blinked, her vacant expression breaking as Mayho called out to her in concern. Snapping back to reality, The elf stammered, completely losing the thread of their conversation, while Mayho pointed out her frequent moments of spacing out. Her eyes still wide and unfocused, she quickly changed the subject, expressing a desperate hope that they would find a teleportation monument soon. Mayho nodded, recalling that this had been their original topic. But the sudden shift in demeanor did not go unnoticed. A deep sense of unease settled in Mayho's gut, a quiet realization that something was terribly wrong with her companion. She pieced together the recent events in her mind, noting a disturbing pattern. The strange, vacant behavior only seemed to trigger whenever the topic of the teleportation monuments was brought up. Continuing her ascent up the stone steps, she pondered the contradiction. She wondered if her friend was secretly hesitant about leaving the tower, yet that directly conflicted with her previously stated desire to attend school in the outside world. Her train of thought was broken as she finally reached the landing of the seemingly endless staircase. She paused at the threshold of an open archway, surprised to find no door blocking their path into the next chamber. Stepping into the circular, brick-lined room, she immediately spotted a solitary object resting in the very center. She raised her hand, pointing eagerly at the dark silhouette. The object was a dark, rectangular slab, its surface marred by deep cracks. She recognized the design instantly, noting its striking resemblance to the structure they had encountered on the bottom floor. Turning back with a bright, hopeful smile, she excitedly asked if this monument might also possess the power to grant wishes. But her companion offered no shared enthusiasm. Instead, the elf stood frozen, her head bowed as cold sweat beaded on her face, before she slowly looked up, her wide eyes filled with an overwhelming, silent terror. She finally broke the silence, confirming to Mayho that the structure before them was indeed a teleportation monument. Mayho immediately cheered at the revelation, though she quickly noticed her companion's lack of enthusiasm, urging her to show at least a little excitement. Instructing Mayho to stay put, the elf stepped forward to inspect the ancient stone herself. Mayho agreed, watching with a hint of confusion as her friend approached the cracked surface. She paused for a tense moment before slowly raising her hand and pressing her palm flat against the dark, monolithic structure. Mayho rushed to her side, panicking that the device might be broken. The swordswoman let out a heavy sigh of relief, assuring her that it was still functional, and gestured for Mayho to look closer at the surface. Peering at the glowing symbols, the teenager marveled at the otherworldly numerals. After confirming she could somehow read them, she casually listed off the available destinations, noting floors 1, 5, and a massive jump straight to 95. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She recoiled in absolute shock, screaming that 95 floors was more than 3 times deeper than any known dungeon in existence. Still buzzing with adrenaline, she babbled about the dungeon's legendary difficulty and eagerly asked how to operate the magical technology. Her excitement, however, was met with a somber, repeated apology from her companion. The elf kept her gaze fixed on the dark stone, her voice heavy with regret as she delivered the crushing news. The teleportation monument could not be used by Mayho. The teenager froze, her eyes widening in sheer disbelief as the weight of the words sank in. Gripping the edge of the monument tightly, the swordswoman explained the cruel reality of the magic. The device required a prior magical signature to function, meaning she could escape to the upper floors, but Mayho was completely trapped. The elf's devastating explanation hung in the air, causing the dark-haired girl's eyes to widen in sudden understanding. The reality of the situation settled heavily upon Mayho's shoulders, and she lowered her gaze, a quiet sigh escaping her lips as the truth finally clicked into place. She mentally retraced her bizarre journey. Having been abruptly dropped into the deepest, most dangerous depths of the labyrinth from the very beginning, she had completely bypassed the upper levels. She had never once laid a hand on a teleportation monument before this moment, making a magical return impossible. Her quiet acceptance was broken by the soft patter of droplets hitting the stone floor. She looked up, her expression softening as she heard a trembling apology. The realization that the swordswoman had suspected this outcome all along hung heavily between them. Tears streamed down the warrior's face as she confessed her fragile, shattered hopes. She admitted that she never expected them to survive this long, praising her companion's incredible resilience. She had desperately clung to the belief that defeating the dungeon's ultimate guardian might somehow bend the rules and grant them a miracle. But that desperate hope had just been crushed. Her weeping was met with a gentle, knowing smile from the teenager, who finally understood why she had been handed the heavy bag of supplies earlier. With a wry chuckle, Mayho joked that she would probably evolve into a wild beast by the time she climbed all the way back to the surface on foot. The dark-haired girl's attempt to humor only fueled her companion's distress. Clutching her chest in anguish, the elf cried out her refusal to leave. She vehemently declared that she would stay behind in the abyss, utterly unwilling to abandon her friend or say a final goodbye. Her desperate declaration was met with a soft, affectionate laugh. The teenager closed her eyes, her expression radiating a calm maturity as she gently dismissed the ridiculous notion of her friend throwing her life away. She stepped forward, firmly holding out the bag of precious magic crystals toward the weeping warrior. Standing before the silent monument, she reminded her friend of the responsibilities waiting on the surface, the tuition fees that needed paying, and the family anxiously awaiting her return. Flashing a bright, reassuring smile, she insisted that she would be perfectly fine, boasting about her loyal animal companions and her fully stocked shelter. She urged the stunned swordswoman to live her own life to the fullest, gently suggesting that she treat their entire incredible journey as nothing more than a fleeting dream to be forgotten. The teenager's selfless words only made the warrior's tears flow harder. Trembling with overwhelming emotion, the elf choked out a broken sob, utterly rejecting the idea that she could ever simply forget the bond they had forged or the sacrifices that had been made. She threw her arms around Mayho, burying her face in the girl's shoulder as she wailed uncontrollably. Mayho simply stood there, accepting the embrace, gently teasing her friend that her tears were going to make the dungeon damp. Her heartbroken sobs echoed through the cold stone chamber, bouncing off the dark, monolithic surface of the teleportation monument. Knowing they couldn't delay any longer, Mayho gently but firmly pushed the weeping warrior toward the exit, urging her to leave before her own resolve began to waver. Standing at the threshold of the portal, Fiona refused to accept this as a final goodbye. She called out across the distance, vowing to use the dragon loot they had gathered to buy the finest weapons and enlist a legendary hero from the city of Mathers. Tears streamed down her face as she fiercely promised to return and pull Mayho out of the abyss. Hearing the desperate vow, Mayho offered a soft, reassuring smile, chuckling that such a rescue wasn't necessary, but admitting she would look forward to it anyway. With that final exchange, Mayho turned her back on the only way home and began to walk deeper into the dungeon. Behind her, Fiona's voice rang out, swearing on her life that she would keep her word. Desperation laced the warrior's final scream, begging Mayho not to die before she could return. Glancing over her shoulder one last time, Mayho offered a bittersweet smile and a quiet farewell, leaving her friend behind as she stepped into the shadows of the 95th floor.